Dawson leaned against the hitching post, trading quiet bets on what the woman would look like. 10 cents says she's got a squint, Cal muttered. Billy grinned. 10 cents says she's got 6 kids she didn't mention in the letter. Wyatt didn't turn around. Both of you shut up. They shut up, but he heard Cal whisper, "Boss is nervous." He wasn't nervous. He was practical. There was a difference. He needed someone who could cook 3 meals a day for 12 men without burning the building down. That was the entire sum of his requirements. He hadn't asked for a companion, hadn't asked for conversation, hadn't asked for anything beyond functional and reliable. The agency letter had said, Emma Whitaker, 31 years old, experienced cook, capable and hardworking. Good enough. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and noise, and Wyatt watched the passengers step onto the platform one by one. A family with young children, a traveling salesman with 2 heavy cases, an elderly preacher squinting against the afternoon light. And then her. She was smaller than he'd expected, dark hair pinned up under a plain gray bonnet, a single trunk being wrestled off the luggage car by a porter she was directing with precise, quiet authority. She carried a worn leather satchel over one shoulder and a book tucked under her arm, a cookbook he realized its spine cracked from use. She didn't look lost. She didn't look frightened. She stood on the platform and scanned the crowd with calm, assessing eyes until they landed on him, and something in her expression said, "So this is what I'm working with." Wyatt walked over. Emma Whitaker. Wyatt Mercer. She extended her hand like she was completing a transaction. "I'd like to see the kitchen before supper." Behind him, he heard Cal swallow a laugh. The kitchen at Mercer Ranch was a disaster, and Emma Whitaker did not pretend otherwise. She walked through it without a word for the first 2 minutes, opened cupboards, checked the stove damper, lifted the lid on a pot of something gray and unidentifiable that had been sitting on the back burner since, judging by the smell, approximately the previous administration. "Who cooked before I arrived?" "Rotation," Wyatt said. "Whoever lost the draw." "How long has this arrangement been in place?" "About a year." She turned and looked at him. "You've been feeding 12 men on a rotation system for a year." "There wasn't another option." "There are always other options," she said, not unkindly, and went back to examining the cupboards. She found hardtack going soft in an open bin, 3 sacks of flour with the top sacks showing mold at the corners. A side of salt pork hung too close to the stove, half dried out. Lard stored in a tin that had clearly been opened and resealed a dozen times. She picked up the tally sheet hanging by the door, the running account of what supplies came in and what went out. She studied it for a long time. "Mr. Mercer?" "Wyatt." "Wyatt?" She set the paper down. "Do you know how much food this ranch wastes every week?" He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. "About 30% of what comes through that door," she said. "Maybe more. Your flour storage is wrong. Your fat storage is wrong. And whoever's been ordering supplies has been ordering on emotion rather than inventory. You've got 3 sacks of cornmeal you probably don't even know about pushed to the back of that lower shelf. They're still good." She paused. "You're losing money in this kitchen before a single meal gets cooked." Wyatt stared at her. "You figured all that out in 5 minutes." "4, she said, and picked up her satchel. "I'll have supper ready at 6. I'd recommend eating it while it's hot, bet." The first meal she cooked stopped conversation at the table. Not because it was complicated. It wasn't. Salt pork properly rendered with pan gravy and biscuits that had actual lift to them, and a pot of beans that had been seasoned like somebody gave the matter genuine thought. But 12 men who had been eating survival food for a year went very quiet when something tasted like it had been made by someone who cared. Cal Briggs ate 3 biscuits without looking up. Old Pete Harlow, who had been on the ranch longer than most of the others and complained about everything as a matter of personal philosophy, paused mid-bite and said nothing, which was the highest praise he was capable of. Billy Dawson looked up from his plate with an expression of uncomplicated wonder. "Ma'am," he said, "where'd you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," Emma said from where she stood refilling the coffee pot. "And every kitchen I've worked in since I was 15. You worked in kitchens like professionally." "Billy," Wyatt said. "No, it's fine." Emma set the coffee pot down. "I worked in a hotel kitchen in Cincinnati for 4 years. Before that, a boarding house in Columbus. I know quantity cooking. I know supply management. And I know when a kitchen is being run into the ground by people who think cooking is just something that happens." The table was very quiet. Wyatt looked at his plate, then at her. "You didn't mention any of that in your letter." "You didn't ask," she said simply, and went back to the stove. The first week established the rules. Emma ran the kitchen with the same quiet, non-negotiable efficiency she'd brought to every question about the pantry. She took inventory the second morning, rewrote the supply list, and handed it to Wyatt without ceremony. "I've cut the weekly food order by almost a quarter," she said. "Same meals, no waste. The difference should show up in the ledger by the end of the month." He looked at the list. "You dropped the fancy flour. The fancy flour is 3 cents more per sack and produces an identical biscuit. The Cowboys don't care about the brand. They care about whether the biscuit is edible." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. "Anything else?" "The large supplier is overcharging you. I checked the prices at Hennessy's store in town. Your current supplier charges nearly double. I'd recommend switching. That supplier has a contract." "When does the contract end?" He paused, thought about it. "End of the month." "Then at the end of the month," Emma said, "I'd recommend not renewing it." She went back to her work. Wyatt stood in the kitchen doorway holding the revised supply list and felt something he couldn't entirely name, a sensation somewhere between impressed and unsettled, like a man who'd hired a housekeeper and come home to find her reorganizing the deed to the property. By the second week, the ranch hands had sorted themselves into 2 distinct camps. The first camp, led by Cal Briggs and Old Pete, held the traditional position. A woman's job was the kitchen was the kitchen, and anything that happened inside it was entirely her business and of no further interest to anyone else, as long as the biscuits kept coming. The second camp, younger, led in spirit, if not in title, by Billy Dawson, followed Emma at a polite but obvious distance whenever she moved around the ranch, not intrusively, but with the alert attention of people who had realized they were watching something interesting unfold. It was Billy who first noticed what Emma was doing with the leftover food. "She's cataloging it," he told Cal, with the intensity of someone reporting on a discovery. Cal didn't look up from the harness he was mending. "She's what?" "Every night before she cleans up, she writes down everything that was left over. How much, what kind, how long it'll keep. Then the next morning she figures out how to use it in the next meal." "That's just cooking." "No," Billy said with the certainty of someone who had grown up watching cooking that was decidedly not this. "That's planning. There's a difference." He was right. Emma's kitchen was not a place where meals happened. It was a system. Every action fed into the next one. Every leftover became an ingredient. Every supply decision rippled forward through 3 days of menus she kept track of in the back of that worn cookbook in handwriting so small and precise it looked like it had been printed. Wyatt saw the notebook once by accident when he came into the kitchen early and found it open on the table. It wasn't just recipes. It was a running account of every cost, every saving, every efficiency she'd found or was still looking for. Numbers in neat columns, notes in the margins, and on one page, a small hand-drawn map of the county with a circle drawn around something about 6 miles northeast of the ranch. He was still looking at it when Emma came through the door. She saw the notebook, and picked it up without comment or embarrassment. "What's that circle?" he asked. A brief pause. "Railroad camp," she said. "New construction. They broke ground 3 weeks ago. I saw the smoke from the east pasture." "What about it?" She looked at him steadily. "About 400 workers, probably more by now. Company food suppliers, from what I've heard, are unreliable. Workers complain. Men who work 14-hour days in the heat care about 2 things: sleep and a decent meal." Wyatt heard what she wasn't saying. He shook his head almost reflexively. "Emma, I haven't said anything yet." You were about to. She closed the notebook and looked at him straight on. The ranch is losing money, Wyatt. Not from bad cattle decisions and not from bad land. From cash flow. You spend money going out and not enough coming in. Your herd is sound. Your hands are loyal. But there's a gap, and the gap is going to get worse before it gets better unless something changes. Something like what? Something like a business, she said. Something like 400 hungry men 6 miles away who are currently eating whatever the company cook manages to throw together, which from everything I've heard is not much. He stared at her. You want to run a food operation. I want to turn a surplus into a revenue stream. There's a difference. You've been here 2 weeks. I know. That's why I haven't done it yet. She met his eyes. I'm asking your permission. The word permission came out clean and unpointed, not like a challenge and not like a plea. Like a woman who understood the rules of the world she was in and was choosing to operate within them for now because it was efficient. Wyatt looked at the map in her notebook, at the circle around the railroad camp, at the numbers in the margins of the page below it, neat and precise, and already calculating something he hadn't thought to calculate. I'll think about it, he said. The answer he came back with was no. He told himself it was practical. A ranch wife hauling food wagons to railroad construction camps wasn't done. His men would think he'd lost control of his own household. The other ranchers in the county would talk. There were appearances to maintain even on a ranch that was bleeding money. He told himself all of this, and it was partly true, and he knew it was partly not. He told Emma at breakfast the same morning Cal had come in to say that the bank had sent another letter about the delayed payment on the East Pasture loan. He expected an argument. Instead, Emma said, "All right," and refilled his coffee cup and turned back to the stove. That was worse somehow. He'd braced for pushback, and the absence of it left him off balance in a way he couldn't explain. He watched her move through the kitchen with that same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. Checked the biscuits. Adjusted the damper. Made a note in her book. Said nothing further. That evening, he found Billy Dawson in the barn, which was not unusual. He found him patching one of the older canvas supply tarps, which was also not unusual. He found him doing it with an expression of careful innocence that set off every instinct Wyatt had developed in 15 years of managing men. Billy. Boss. What are you doing? Patching the tarp. Why? Billy looked up, looked back down. Mrs. Mercer asked me to. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have. She say why? Said a tarp in good condition is useful to have around. It was technically true. It was also Wyatt realized the kind of true that was doing a great deal of work on behalf of a much larger truth that Billy had been specifically instructed not to mention. He looked at the tarp, at its dimensions, at the way it had been cut and reinforced along the edges. That's the right size to rig over a wagon bed, he said. Billy said nothing, which was the loudest possible confirmation. Wyatt stood there for a long moment, felt the specific sensation of a man who has said no to something that is going to happen anyway. He walked back to the house, went into the kitchen where Emma was finishing the supper cleanup alone, the way she always did, because she had never once asked for help with it. Emma. She looked up. 1 wagon, he said. Billy goes with you. You come back before dark. Something moved in her expression, not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter and more settled, like a person who had been patient long enough. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. If it doesn't work, it stops. If it doesn't work, she said evenly, I'll tell you so myself. He almost believed her. He did believe her, which surprised him. He walked out of the kitchen before he had to decide what to do with that particular realization. 3 days later, Emma Whitaker Mercer loaded a wagon with biscuits, beans, roasted salt pork, and 2 deep pans of cornbread, hitched a horse to the front, told Billy to drive, and set out northeast toward the railroad camp she'd had circled in her notebook since the first week she arrived. She came back 4 hours later. The pans were empty. She had $11 in her apron pocket. She stood in the kitchen and counted it out on the table without a word, and then she looked up at Wyatt where he stood in the doorway, and she said, "Tomorrow I'll need 2 wagons." The cowboys eating supper behind her went absolutely still. Old Pete set down his fork for the second time in as many weeks, and Wyatt Mercer, rancher widower man who had hired a cook and received something else entirely, looked at the $11 on the table and felt the ground shift quietly under everything he thought he'd understood about his own ranch. 2 wagons, he said. 2 wagons, she confirmed. He looked at the money. He looked at her. Fine, he said. 2 wagons. And for the first time since Emma Whitaker had stepped off that train with her 1 trunk and her worn cookbook and her marriage contract, Wyatt Mercer walked back outside feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Like the ranch might actually be all right. 2 wagons became 4 by the end of the second week. Nobody planned it that way. It happened the same way most things happened around Emma Mercer, not through announcement or argument, but through simple, undeniable arithmetic. The first railroad camp had 400 workers. The second camp, 3 miles further east along the new grade, had closer to 600. And word traveled fast among men who ate bad food every day of their working lives. A decent meal in the middle of nowhere wasn't just food. It was an event. Billy Dawson came back from the second run with a bruised knuckle and a story. 2 fellas from Camp 2 tried to follow us back, he told Wyatt with the slightly dazed expression of someone still processing what had happened. On horseback. Said they wanted to know if we'd come to their camp. I told them I couldn't promise anything. They said they'd pay double. Wyatt looked at Emma. Emma was already writing in her notebook. "Double is unnecessary," she said without looking up. "Standard price is fair, but we'll add Camp 2 to the Thursday run." Cal Briggs, standing in the doorway, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a complaint. It existed in the precise territory between the two. "Mrs. Mercer," he said carefully, "we've only got 4 horses fit for wagon work right now." "I know," Emma said. "I'm working on that." "Working on it how?" She looked up. "Cal, do you want fewer biscuits tomorrow morning, or do you want to trust that I'm working on it?" Cal opened his mouth, closed it, chose the biscuits. The horse problem solved itself inside 3 days. Emma had been corresponding. Wyatt discovered this gradually, the way you discover a river has changed course with a widow named Martha Gaines, who lived 12 miles west and owned 2 strong draft horses she had no particular use for since her husband died. Emma had met her exactly once at the dry goods store in town, in a conversation that had lasted approximately 7 minutes. By the end of that 7 minutes, she had learned about the horses, the widow's financial difficulty, the widow's adult daughter who could cook, and the fact that Martha Gaines had been quietly furious at the world for 2 years and was waiting for someone to give her a reason to stop being furious and start being useful. Emma offered her a percentage, a small one, but reliable. Martha showed up on a Tuesday with her 2 horses, her daughter Rose, and an expression that said she had not been this interested in anything since 1883. "I heard about you," Martha said, looking Emma over with frank assessment. "Good things, I hope." "Mixed," Martha said. "But the interesting kind of mixed. What do you need me to do?" That was how the operation got its second cook. Wyatt found out about Martha Gaines and the arrangement the same way he found out about most things happening on his own ranch at this particular point in time after the fact, when the decision was already made, and the only remaining question was whether he had any objection worth raising. He stood in the kitchen watching Emma explain the new supply rotation to Martha and Rose, and felt something he identified after a moment's honest reflection as a man who had been the most capable person in a room for most of his adult life, coming to terms with the fact that he was no longer the most capable person in this particular room. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was also underneath the discomfort faintly thrilling in a way he had no intention of examining closely. "Emma," he said from the doorway. She looked up. "I was going to tell you." When there was something to tell. Right now there's just an arrangement. An arrangement that involves 2 more people and 2 horses living on my ranch. Temporarily. Martha and Rose will go back home each evening. The horses will stay in the east barn. I've already asked Pete to clear the two end stalls." She paused. Pete agreed. Pete never agrees to anything. Pete agreed when I pointed out that the horses would bring in more revenue per month than the stalls were currently generating by standing empty. She said it without smugness, just matter-of-factly the way she said everything. "I can walk you through the numbers if you'd like." Wyatt looked at Martha Gaines, who was looking back at him with the expression of a woman who had already made her decision and found the negotiation phase mildly entertaining. He looked at Rose, who was 17 years old and had the same calm, direct eyes as her mother. He looked at Emma. "Fine," he said. "Show me the numbers." She showed him the numbers. He sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of him, and she walked him through every line. Income by camp cost per meal supply expenses, the percentage going to Martha, the projected increase when Camp 3 came online next week. Her handwriting was still that small, precise script, but the numbers themselves were large, and they were real, and they pointed in one direction, without ambiguity. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "You've been planning this since before you arrived," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It came out more like the statement of a man putting a puzzle together and finding the last piece. Emma considered the question honestly. "I've been thinking about problems like this for a long time," she said. "Your ranch happened to have most of the pieces already in place. I just noticed." "The ranch hands mock it," Wyatt said quietly, not defending it, just naming it. "Some of them." She closed the notebook. "They'll stop." "How do you know?" "Because they're practical men," she said. "And practical men change their minds when the evidence changes." She was right about that too. He was starting to find it exhausting how often she was right. Not because he resented it, but because it kept catching him off guard, the specific rhythm of it, the quiet statement, the flat certainty, the outcome that proved her out. The evidence changed for Cal Briggs on a Thursday in the 4th week. Cal was the one Wyatt would have bet on last. He was 38, had been on the ranch for 9 years, and held opinions the way certain men held property with a grip that made no allowance for the possibility of revision. He'd said almost nothing critical to Emma's face, but Wyatt had heard him in the bunkhouse the low muttered commentary about women who didn't know their place about a ranch turning into a cookhouse, about what kind of man let his wife run a food wagon operation while he managed cattle. What changed Cal's mind was not the money, though the money was hard to argue with. What changed Cal's mind was the afternoon he rode his horse wrong on the North Pasture Road, a bad step that cost the horse a thrown shoe and cost Cal a 4-mile walk back to the ranch in the July heat, arriving at the kitchen door at 3 in the afternoon with a badly twisted ankle and the look of a man who had been humbled by the landscape. Emma sat him down, set a cold compress on his ankle before he'd finished explaining what happened, put food in front of him without asking whether he wanted it because she could see he hadn't eaten since early morning, made coffee, and then while he ate she said, "Your saddle girth is wrong on the left side. It's been sitting crooked for at least 2 weeks. That puts extra stress on the horse's near foreleg. He's not going to take that trail well until it's corrected." Cal stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I watched you ride out Tuesday morning. I noticed the sit." She paused. "I grew up on a farm, Cal. I know horses." He was quiet for a while. Then, "Why didn't you say something Tuesday?" "I thought you might not want to be told by me." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones they'd had before, something shifting in it. Cal looked down at his coffee cup, then back up. "You're not what I thought you were," he said finally. "Most people aren't," Emma said, and went back to her work. Cal Briggs came in early the next morning and asked if there was anything on the ranch that needed doing. Not for wages he was already paid. Just something that needed doing in the particular way of a man who has decided to be useful without making a production of it. Emma handed him a supply list and told him which lumberyard in town gave the best price per board foot. He went. He came back with exactly what she'd specified and didn't say another word about it. That was Cal converted. Wyatt watched this happen from a distance and felt the ranch reorganizing itself around Emma, The way iron filings organize around a magnet, not forced, not coerced, just drawn by a force that was simply quietly stronger than the resistance. The real trouble started on a Monday morning in the 5th week. It started with a letter. Wyatt recognized the envelope, heavy cream paper, the kind that cost money, and was meant to convey the fact that it cost money. He'd seen envelopes like it before, usually when someone important was about to make his life difficult. The name on the return corner was R. Sloan Wyoming Territory Railroad Development Commission. He read it at the kitchen table while Emma was starting the morning biscuits. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the window for a moment. "Wyatt?" Emma's voice without turning around. She had an uncanny ability to hear the quality of silence behind her. "What does it say?" "Man named Sloan, railroad executive. He's heard about the food operation." He paused. "He wants to meet." Emma turned. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where he makes an offer." A long pause. The biscuit dough kept getting worked slow and steady. "What kind of offer?" Wyatt looked at the letter again. "He's proposing to buy the food service operation, integrate it into the railroad company's official supply chain." He read the number. Then he looked up. "Emma, it's not a good number." "How not good?" "About a third of what you'd make in a single year at the current rate." He set the letter down. He's not offering to buy a business. He's offering to buy a problem that's inconveniencing him. Emma set down the dough, wiped her hands on her apron, crossed to the table and picked up the letter. She read it once. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, a very slight, very controlled stillness, the kind that a person develops when they have learned not to show anger in situations where showing anger costs them something. "He found out quickly," she said. "Word travels." "Not this quickly." She set the letter down. "Someone told him." Wyatt thought about that. Could be anybody in town. Supply orders the dry goods store, the lumberyard. Could be, she said. But she looked thoughtful in a way that suggested she already had a different theory and was deciding whether to share it. "What do you want to do about the meeting?" "I want to know what you want to do about it." She looked at him. This was still, even now, something that caught her slightly off guard, the directness of it, the genuine question underneath it. She had spent enough time reading Wyatt Mercer in 5 weeks to know that the question was real. "I want to go to the meeting," she said. "I want to hear what he says in person. A man who writes a letter like this talks differently in a room, and the way he talks in a room tells you more than the letter does. You've dealt with men like this before." It wasn't quite a question. Emma picked up the letter once more and folded it along its original crease. "In the hotel in Cincinnati," she said, "there was a man who owned the building. He tried to buy the kitchen operation from the head cook for about half of what it was worth. When she refused, he started cutting her supply deliveries. A pound of butter here, a sack of flour there. Small enough that it was hard to prove big enough that it mattered." "What happened?" "She quit." A pause. "I didn't quit. I reorganized the supply chain so he couldn't cut it without it being obvious. He backed down." She set the letter on the table. "I was 24 years old. I didn't have a ranch behind me then." Wyatt looked at the letter, at Emma. He felt something solidify in his chest, not protectiveness exactly, though there was some of that. Something more like the decision a man makes when he has been watching the river and has finally determined which direction it's going to go. "You have a ranch behind you now," he said. The words came out quieter than he intended. Emma heard them anyway. Her eyes met his for a moment that lasted a fraction of a second longer than was purely informational, and then she picked up the biscuit dough and went back to the stove. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not worried." The meeting with Sloan was set for the following Wednesday in town. In the days between, Emma ran the operation the way she always ran everything, with her attention fully on the work in front of her, and an eye on 3 things happening slightly to the left of it. She added Camp 3 to the Wednesday run. She negotiated a new flour supply rate with a merchant in the next county who was undercutting the local price. She trained Rose Gaines to manage the second wagon independently, which took 2 days, and the kind of patient-specific instruction that turned a 17-year-old who could cook into a 17-year-old who could cook and run a supply chain. "You're going to be fine," Emma told Rose on the morning of the second independent run. Rose looked at the wagon, at the loaded pans, at the route map Emma had drawn for her. What if something goes wrong? Something will go wrong. Something always goes wrong. The question is whether you can think while it's going wrong. Emma looked at her steadily. "You can. I've watched you." Rose squared her shoulders and drove. She came back 3 hours later with empty pans and the money in the right order and an expression on her face that was the specific expression of a person who has discovered they are more capable than they thought they were. Martha Gaines. Watching her daughter climb down from the wagon, looked at Emma with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite recognition, but contained elements of both. "My husband always said cooking was just cooking," Martha said. "Your husband was wrong," Emma said without heat, and they went back inside. Wyatt watched all of it and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the evidence wasn't already saying louder. What he was actually thinking about was the look on Emma's face when she read Sloane's letter. The controlled stillness. The folded crease. The fact that she had been 24 years old in a Cincinnati hotel kitchen, outmaneuvering a man who owned the building, and she had never mentioned it in the letter, never put it in the introduction, never offered it as a credential. Because she never needed to offer her credentials. She just started doing the work, and the work spoke. He went to find her that evening after supper when she was finishing the last of the kitchen cleanup alone as always. "Emma?" "Wyatt." "The meeting Wednesday. I'm coming with you." She stopped, turned. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." He met her eyes. "I want to." She looked at him for a moment, that same quiet assessment she'd given him on the platform the first day. The look that took the measure of a thing before deciding what to do with it. Then she nodded. "All right," she said. "Then you should know men like Sloane expect the husband to do the talking. He'll direct everything at you and wait for me to defer. And I need you to not let him." Wyatt held her gaze. "I won't let him," he said. Something crossed her face, then small, contained, real. Not the performance of emotion, but the actual thing. She turned back to the stove. "Good," she said. "Supper's been good this week, by the way." "It's always good." "I know. I'm just noting it." A beat. "Go get some sleep, Wyatt. Wednesday's going to be a long day." He went. And lying in the dark in his room that night, listening to the ranch settle around him, Wyatt Mercer thought about the word partner. Not the word he'd used. Not the word either of them had used, and wondered when exactly that had become the most accurate word for what was happening between them. He fell asleep without an answer. But for the first time in a very long time, the question itself didn't feel like a problem. Outside the ranch breathed easy in the summer dark. 6 camps worth of revenue in the books, 4 wagons fueled and ready, and 1 woman asleep with her notebook on the bedside table the next 3 weeks, already mapped in handwriting so small and precise it looked like it had been carved from certainty. Wednesday was coming, and so, though none of them knew it yet, was Richard Sloane. Richard Sloane was already seated when they arrived. That was intentional. Wyatt recognized the move immediately. The man who controls the room arrives first, takes the chair with its back to the wall, lets the other party walk in and orient themselves around him. It was a power arrangement, the kind that certain men deployed so automatically they probably didn't realize they were doing it anymore. Sloane was somewhere in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the way that railroad money dressed, not flashy, but precise. Every detail calibrated. He stood when they entered, which was the correct social gesture, and he extended his hand to Wyatt first, which was the tell. "Mr. Mercer, good of you to come." His eyes moved to Emma, with the specific quality of a man acknowledging a presence without quite addressing it. "And Mrs. Mercer." "Mr. Sloane," Emma said before Wyatt could respond to anything. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited to sit. Opened her notebook on the table, looked at him directly. You wrote that you had a proposal. I'd like to hear it in full before we discuss anything. Sloan blinked. Just once. Then he sat back down and smiled the smile of a man recalibrating. Of course, he said. And he looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him and said nothing. The silence stretched for exactly long enough to be a message. Then Sloan cleared his throat and looked at Emma. As I outlined in the letter gave me a number, Emma said. It didn't give me the reasoning. I want the reasoning. Another recalibration. Sloan clasped his hands on the table. Mrs. Mercer, the railroad, has an obligation to provide consistent, standardized food service to its workers across all active construction sites. An independent operation, however, well run, introduces variables that complicate our supply chain management. You mean it competes with your current supplier? A pause. The railroad has existing contracts with a supplier whose workers have filed 3 complaints in the last 6 weeks about food quality. Emma kept her voice level. I know this because 3 of those workers are now regulars at our Camp 2 run on Thursdays. They told me themselves. She paused. Your current supplier is underpaying his cooks, cutting corners on protein and pocketing the difference. You're losing worker productivity because men who eat badly work badly. That's not a supply chain variable. That's a structural problem. Sloan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wyatt. Wyatt picked up his coffee cup and waited. Sloan looked back at Emma. The number I offered, he began, is insulting, Emma said. We both know it. You know it more than I do because you know what the contract with your current supplier costs, and I've estimated it, and the number you offered me is about 40% of your current annual spend on food service. She tilted her head slightly. You're not offering to buy a business. You're offering to make a nuisance go away cheaply. The room was quiet. A clock ticked somewhere. Outside on the street, a wagon went past. Sloan leaned forward. When he spoke again, the pleasant calibration was gone. What replaced it was quieter and more direct and considerably less friendly. Mrs. Mercer, I admire efficiency. I genuinely do. But you are operating a food wagon service out of a cattle ranch kitchen with 2 draft horses and a 17-year-old girl as your second driver. The railroad is a territorial infrastructure project with capital resources you cannot match. The practical question is not whether your operation is good. The practical question is how long you can sustain it without the cooperation of the entity that controls access to every construction camp in this county. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Emma didn't move. She looked at Sloan steadily, the way she looked at everything that required measuring without flinching and without hurrying. Thank you for being direct, she said. I prefer it. She closed her notebook. She stood up. She looked at Wyatt. Wyatt set down his coffee cup and stood up. We'll be in touch, Emma said, and she walked out. They rode back to the ranch in silence for the first mile. Wyatt was the one who broke it. He's going to block the camps. Yes. How long do we have? He'll need to communicate with his site managers. 2 days, maybe 3. She was looking straight ahead. He'll tell them the independent food service is a liability issue. Insurance, sanitation, something official sounding. The managers will comply because they work for him. Wyatt absorbed this. And then the workers go back to eating whatever the company supplier provides. And we have food that won't sell and wages to pay, and the supply costs we've already committed to for next week's runs. The numbers moved through Wyatt's mind fast and unpleasant. Emma, I know. That's not a small problem. I know, Wyatt. Her voice was controlled, but underneath it something was tightly wound. Not panic. Something more like contained fury, the kind that burns cold rather than hot. I knew he was going to do it. I just hoped he'd be less obvious about the timeline. If you knew he was going to do it, why didn't you? Because I needed to hear him say it. She turned to look at him for the first time since they'd left town. When a man like that tells you directly that he controls your access, he's also telling you what he's afraid of. He's not afraid of the food wagons. He's afraid of what the food wagons represent. Which is what? A supply network he doesn't control. She turned back to the road. That matters. That's information. Wyatt thought about the meeting, about the recalibrations, about the moment when Sloane's pleasantness had dropped away and something harder had taken its place. He came to that meeting expecting to buy you out or scare you off. When neither worked, he told me the truth, that he controls every camp. A pause. Every camp on his railroad. The last 3 words sat in the air between them. Wyatt turned them over. His railroad, he said slowly. Emma said nothing, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else, and Wyatt felt the particular sensation of a man who has just seen someone else's hand and realized it was better than he'd understood. Emma, he said, what do you know about the other railroad? Enough, she said, to think it might be worth a letter. The block came down in 2 days, not 3. Sloane was efficient. Wyatt would give him that. By Friday morning, every camp manager along the eastern grade had received written instruction that independent food service vendors were prohibited from operating within the camp boundaries, citing a new territorial health and sanitation ordinance that, as far as Wyatt could determine when he asked the town's one attorney, did not actually exist in any documented form. Billy Dawson came back from the Thursday run, looking like he'd been personally insulted, which he had. Camp manager at 2 just turned us away, Billy said. He was still holding the reins, sitting on the wagon seat, not quite able to process it into ordinary language. Said there's a new company policy, showed me a letter. I read it 3 times. It doesn't cite any real law, it's just a letter. I know, Emma said. Mrs. Mercer, we've got 4 full pans of cornbread and 2 of beans and enough salt pork for 200 men and nowhere to. I know, Billy. She put her hand briefly on his arm. Unhitch the horses and put the food in the cold storage. I'll figure out what to do with it. He looked at her. He was 20 years old and she was 31. And in that moment, he looked at her the way you look at someone who has been your North Star for long enough that you're not entirely sure what direction you face without them. What are we going to do? We're going to wait, she said. And while we wait, we're going to do everything exactly right, so that when the waiting ends, we're ready. He nodded. He unhitched the horses. He trusted her, which was the most anyone could do for someone else when the ground was unsteady. The rest of that day was quiet in the particular way of a ranch holding its breath. The food sat in cold storage. The wagons sat in the yard. Martha Gaines came in at noon, got the news and sat down at the kitchen table with the expression of a woman who had been disappointed by the world before and had developed the capacity to sit with that disappointment without letting it flatten her. What do we do about Rose? Martha asked. She meant the wages. The arrangement. Rose is still employed, Emma said immediately. So are you. We may not be running wagons this week, but there's work to do. What kind of work? Emma set her notebook on the table and opened it to a page Wyatt hadn't seen before. Planning work, she said. The letter to the Pacific Continental Railroad took Emma 2 full evenings to write. Wyatt knew she was writing it. He didn't ask to read it partly because she didn't offer, and partly because he had learned in 6 weeks of living on the same ranch as Emma Mercer that the thing she was most capable of was knowing exactly what a situation required and providing it without oversight. Asking to read the letter would have been like asking her to explain the biscuit recipe. She would have explained it without complaint, but the question itself would have revealed a misunderstanding of who was in charge of the biscuits. He heard her moving in the kitchen late both nights. The scratch of the pen. Long pauses, the occasional crumple of paper that meant she'd started over. On the 3rd morning, she handed him a sealed envelope. I need this to go to the Pacific Continental Regional Office in Cheyenne, she said. I need it to go today, not tomorrow. Wyatt looked at the envelope, looked at her. What does it say? It says that there is an established operational food service capable of serving between 400 and 600 workers per day with an existing supply chain trained staff and a proven record, and that this service is currently available for an exclusive contract with a railroad company operating in the Wyoming Territory that is not the Wyoming Eastern. She paused. It says a number of other things, but that's the core of it. The Pacific Continental is the Wyoming Eastern's main competitor for the northern grade. Yes. If Sloan finds out you've approached them, he'll find out eventually regardless. The question is whether we have something in place before he does. She held his gaze steadily. Wyatt, I know what I'm doing. He took the envelope. He rode to the telegraph station in town and sent it express. Rode back. Told Emma it was done. She said, "Thank you," and went back to work. What followed were the 7 longest days Wyatt Mercer could remember since the year the winter killed 40% of his herd and he'd had to wait out a blizzard without knowing if the rest would survive. The specific quality of waiting when the outcome is entirely out of your hands and everything you've built is balanced on the answer. The food operation shut down completely by the 2nd day. There were no camps they could legally access. Rose and Martha came in and helped with ranch cooking and supply inventory, and tried not to act like people watching a fire consume something they'd built. Billy Dawson took to doing maintenance work on the wagons with the dedicated focus of a man who needed to believe the wagons would be used again. Cal Briggs. Cal, who had spent the first 2 weeks convinced the whole enterprise was beneath the dignity of the ranch, came to Emma on the 4th day and said with the blunt economy of a man who didn't do speeches, "This is wrong what Sloan's doing. Everybody knows it's wrong." "I know," Emma said. "You got a plan." "I've got a letter out." Cal considered this. "How long for an answer?" "I don't know." He nodded. "I'll handle the east fence line while we wait. Keep the men busy." He paused at the door. "Mrs. Mercer, for what it's worth." He stopped, restarted. "You've done right by this ranch. Every one of us knows it." Emma looked at him. Something moved in her expression, genuine, unguarded, just for a second. "Thank you, Cal." He went. Emma stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, one hand flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. Then she straightened up and went back to work. Wyatt had seen it. He'd been in the doorway, and she hadn't noticed him, and he'd seen that single, unguarded second, the slight drop in the shoulders. The breath she took, that was just slightly deeper than her regular breathing. The effort of holding steady, when steady was costing something. He walked in quietly. "Emma." She looked up, composed again. "I'm fine." "I know you are." He sat down at the table. "Sit down anyway." She looked at him for a moment. Then, surprising him slightly, she sat. "Tell me something," he said. "The Cincinnati kitchen, the supply manager who tried to cut your deliveries. Were you afraid?" A long pause. "Yes." "You didn't act afraid. Acting afraid doesn't help." She looked at her hands on the table. "Being afraid is just information. It tells you what's at stake. The question is what you do with it." "What did you do with it then?" "I fixed the supply chain." A pause. "I'm trying to fix the supply chain now." He looked at her hands, at the notebook beside them, at the woman who had arrived with one trunk and a worn cookbook and a marriage contract, and had quietly, methodically built something on this ranch that 12 cowboys and 2 widows and 1 overwhelmed rancher had not been able to build in years. "You're going to fix it," he said. It came out with more certainty than he'd planned. She looked up at him. "You sound very sure of that." "I've watched you work for 6 weeks," he said. "I've never seen you fail to fix something you decided to fix." She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm, and the evening was settling in around them, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, one of the hands was playing a harmonica badly. "The letter might not come back right," she said, quietly. Just the 2 of them in the room. "It might not," he agreed. "If it doesn't, then we figure out what comes next," Wyatt said. "That's what people do." She looked at him across the table. The light was low and the moment was real, and neither of them moved. Then Emma straightened and picked up her notebook, and the professional distance closed over again, like water over a stone, smooth and practiced. "You should eat something," she said. "I'll heat up the leftover beans." "Emma." "Wyatt." A beat. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the beans." She understood him. He could tell by the way she didn't answer right away. Go tell Billy to stop working on the wagon wheels, she said finally, her voice steady. He's been at it for 3 hours, and he'll strip the bolts. He went, and he almost missed it, almost the very quiet, very private sound she made when she thought she was alone. Not a cry, not anything dramatic, just a breath. The kind that costs you something to take and something to let out, and means you are holding up under a weight you have never once asked anyone else to carry. He walked out to find Billy. He didn't mention what he'd heard. Some things a person is entitled to keep. The telegram arrived on the morning of the 8th day. Wyatt was at the barn. Emma was in the kitchen. Billy Dawson ran from the road to the kitchen door so fast he skidded on the porch boards, and his voice when he called out was so loud it brought 3 cowboys in from the yard and Martha Gaines up from the cold storage in under a minute. Mrs. Mercer, there's a telegram." Emma came to the door, took the paper from his hand, read it. The kitchen was absolutely silent. 8 people watching one woman read one piece of paper. She read it twice. Then she looked up, and the expression on her face was the same controlled, measured expression she brought to everything. But her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been in 8 days. "Well," she said. "Well what?" Billy demanded. Emma set the telegram on the table. "Someone call Wyatt in from the barn," she said. "And put the coffee on. We have a contract to discuss." Billy was already running. Martha Gaines picked up the telegram and read it, and let out a sound that was half laugh and half the specific release of tension that comes from holding something tight for too long. Rose looked at her mother. "Is it good?" Martha looked up with wet eyes and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something like this since 1883. "Baby," she said, "it's better than good." The telegram was 11 words. Proposal received. Interested in exclusive arrangement. Send representative to Cheyenne. Pacific Continental. 11 words that had arrived after 8 days of silence and empty wagons and food sitting in cold storage, and Billy Dawson stripping wagon bolts out of nervous energy. 11 words that meant the gamble had not failed. That the letter had landed in the right hands, and the right hands had done the right math. Wyatt read it standing in the kitchen doorway, still holding his work gloves. He read it twice. Then he looked at Emma. She was watching him read it with the careful stillness of someone who has already processed the information and is now waiting to see how it lands in someone else. "Cheyenne," he said. "Yes. That's a 2-day ride. 1.5 if we leave early." She took the telegram back, folded it precisely along its original crease. "I need to go in person. A letter got us this far. The contract won't close on paper alone. They'll want to look at whoever they're dealing with and decide if the operation is real." Wyatt set his gloves on the table. "I'll go with you." "You don't need to, Emma." His voice was quiet and final, in the way it got sometimes, the way that wasn't commanding, but simply settled. "I'll go with you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. "We leave Thursday morning. That gives me 2 days to prepare." 2 days was not very long. Emma used every hour of them. She drafted a summary of the operation. Camp served meals per day, supply chain structure, revenue figures, staff count, in the small, precise handwriting that covered 4 pages of her notebook. She had Martha review the numbers, not because she doubted them, but because a second pair of eyes on a document going to a railroad company was basic sense. Martha found one arithmetic error in the 3rd column, corrected it without comment, and handed it back. "You're going to do fine," Martha said. "I know," Emma said. Not arrogance. Just the same flat certainty she brought to everything that had a solution. "I'm more worried about what happens here while we're gone. Rose and I have run the kitchen before. The kitchen, yes. But if Sloan hears we've gone to Cheyenne and figures out why..." She stopped. Thought. "He may try something while we're away. I don't know what. But a man who moves fast enough to block 6 camps in 2 days moves fast when he thinks he has an opening." Martha folded her hands on the table. She was 51 years old and had buried a husband and raised a daughter alone on a farm 12 miles west. And she had the specific quality of a woman who had been underestimated so many times, it no longer registered as an insult, only as information about the person doing the underestimating. "Emma," she said, "I have been handling men who think they have openings since before you were born. You go to Cheyenne. I'll be here." Emma looked at her for a long moment. Something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, or not only that, but the particular understanding of two women who have each separately learned to build things in spaces where nobody expected them to build anything. "Cal knows the situation," Emma said. "If anything happens, anything at all, he talks to you first." "Understood. And Billy is not to do anything dramatic." Martha's mouth twitched. "I'll tell him that. Whether it takes is another matter." They left Thursday before sunrise. The ride to Cheyenne was long and gave them time they hadn't had before. Unstructured time. No kitchen behind them, no ranch in front of them. Just the road and the early morning and the particular quality of two people who have been living and working in close proximity for 6 weeks, discovering for the first time what they sound like when neither of them has anything to manage. It started with practical conversation. Supply logistics. What Emma planned to present to the Pacific Continental representatives. What questions they'd likely ask. What concessions she was willing to make and what she wasn't. Then somewhere in the second hour, it shifted. "Tell me about the hotel," Wyatt said. Emma glanced at him. "Cincinnati. You've mentioned it twice. The supply manager, the kitchen reorganization. You were 24. He kept his eyes on the road. "What were you doing in Cincinnati at 24, working in a hotel kitchen?" A pause. "I went there because my mother died and the farm in Ohio needed to be sold, and I needed wages that weren't dependent on weather." She said it evenly, the way you say things that happened long enough ago, that the sharpest edges have worn smooth. "The hotel was the best-paying kitchen work I could find. I was good at it. They knew I was good at it, which meant they paid me less than the men doing equivalent work because they knew I needed the job. That's a specific grievance. It's a specific fact." She looked at him. "Does it bother you that I notice things like that?" "No." He considered it honestly. "It makes me think about how much I probably didn't notice before you got here." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't notice until someone points at the thing directly. Then they either believe what they're seeing, or they decide the person pointing is the problem." "Which category did your hotel manager fall into?" "The second." A beat. "Which is why I reorganized the supply chain in a way that made the problem impossible to ignore or dismiss." She paused. "I was very thorough. The manager ended up having a conversation with the hotel owner about kitchen operations that I suspect he found uncomfortable." Wyatt almost smiled. "And then you left anyway." "I left because I'd learned everything that kitchen had to teach me. And because the boarding house in Columbus offered me a management position, not just a cook's wage." She looked at the road ahead. "I've always known when a room has given me everything it has to give." He thought about that. "Is that what the ranch is? A room?" She looked at him sideways. "No," she said, quietly. "The ranch is different." He didn't push it further, but he held the answer somewhere careful, the way you hold something that might break if you grip it wrong. The Pacific Continental Regional Office was in a building that knew it was important and had been built to make sure visitors knew it too. Wyatt felt Emma steady beside him as they walked in. Not tense, not performing confidence, just exactly what she was. He had noticed this about her: she never performed. Most people walking into a room with that much mahogany and that many framed portraits of railroad executives would have made some small adjustment to their posture, their expression, the way they held their coat. Emma just walked in the same way she walked into her own kitchen. The man who received them was named Harland Foster, Pacific Continental's Territorial Supply Director. He was in his late 40s, efficient, and had the look of someone who had seen a great many proposals and developed a reliable instinct for sorting the real ones from the hopeful ones. He shook Wyatt's hand. He shook Emma's hand. He gestured them to chairs on the same side of the table, which was a better sign than Sloane's arrangement had been. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "The letter was impressive." "Thank you. I want to be direct about what we're looking for so we don't waste each other's time." He folded his hands. "The Wyoming Eastern has the northern grade locked up legally. We're running parallel to them on the southern route, and we're behind schedule because we cannot keep workers on site longer than 6 weeks before turnover eats our progress." Morale. Food is the most consistent complaint in every exit interview we've conducted. If you can solve the food problem, you solve 30% of the turnover problem. Emma opened her notebook. "How many workers currently on the southern grade?" "About 800. Expected to peak at 1,400 by late fall." She wrote the number down. "Current cost per worker per day for food service, Foster told her. She wrote it down. Did not react to the number, but Wyatt, who had seen Emma's operation run at a profit for 6 weeks, understood immediately from the way she wrote it that the number was high and the current supplier was delivering well below its worth. "What we need," Foster continued, "is reliability, not gourmet, not variety. Men who work 14-hour days need hot food at the right time in the right quantity. They need to feel like someone gave the matter genuine thought." "I understand that," Emma said. "I've been feeding railroad workers for 6 weeks, and I have not once been late, have not once shorted a camp, and have not once had a worker complaint reach back to me. I have references from 3 camp foremen if you want them." Foster looked at her. "You have written references?" "I have written references," Emma confirmed and produced them from the front of her notebook. 3 letters signed by the foreman of the camps she'd been serving, before Sloan blocked her, praising the food quality, the reliability, and in one case, with what was clearly genuine feeling, the simple fact that the workers were happy on days she came. Foster read them carefully, twice, set them down. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer. Please. Sloan blocked you. You're sitting here because his railroad closed your access. That tells me 2 things. 1, your operation was significant enough to register as a threat. 2, you don't have the capital to fight him legally." He held her gaze. "If we contract with you and Sloan pushes back, and he will, because blocking you once and watching you pivot to his competition will make him furious, can you hold—" The room was very quiet. Wyatt kept his hands still on the table. Emma looked at Foster without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "Because your contract gives me scale I don't currently have, and scale is what makes an operation difficult to crush. Sloan could block 6 camps because I was serving 6 camps. If I'm serving 1,400 workers under an exclusive contract with the Pacific Continental, the calculation changes entirely." She paused. "He'd be picking a fight with your company, not mine." Foster looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wyatt for the first time since the pleasantries. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "your wife is the most prepared person who has walked into this office in 2 years." Wyatt looked at Emma, at the notebook, at the references in Foster's hand, at the woman who had arrived on his ranch with 1 trunk and a marriage contract and had spent 6 weeks quietly building something nobody else had thought to build. "I know," Wyatt said. "I'm still catching up." The contract negotiation took 3 hours. Foster was fair, which Emma had assessed correctly from the first 5 minutes. He was the kind of man who wanted a deal that worked, not a deal that looked like he'd won. He pushed on the cost per meal, and Emma held her line with numbers she could justify to the cent. He pushed on the expansion timeline. Could she scale to 1,400 workers by October? Emma said yes, walked him through exactly how, and named 3 specific supply adjustments that would make it possible. He pushed once on the question of what happened if she couldn't staff the operation. "I have 2 trained cooks, 1 in training, and a foreman who can manage supply logistics," Emma said. "I also have a ranch full of men who have watched this operation run for 6 weeks and could replicate the supply process if required. And I have a list of 4 women in the county who have approached me about employment and have not yet been hired because I didn't have the volume to justify bringing them on." She looked at Foster steadily. "Volume is what you're offering me. I have the people ready." Foster sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling briefly, the expression of a man doing final arithmetic. Then he looked at Emma. Exclusive contract, he said. Southern grade all active camps 6 months with renewal option. I'll have legal draft the terms tonight. You can review tomorrow morning before you ride back. Emma extended her hand across the table. Agreed. He shook it, looked at it for a moment afterward, the faint expression of a man who has just done something slightly different from what he expected, and found it went perfectly well. They had dinner in Cheyenne that evening, in a restaurant that was not the ranch kitchen at a table that was not surrounded by 12 cowboys. It was the first time since Emma had arrived that they had sat across from each other without the ranch in between them. Wyatt watched her relax degree by degree, the operational efficiency setting aside like a coat she'd been wearing all day. She ordered without hesitation. Made a quiet observation about the kitchen's timing, she couldn't help it, and then caught herself and laughed a small, real laugh that he realized was the first time he'd heard her laugh without anything else in it. You noticed the kitchen timing, he said. Occupational damage, she said. I always notice. What's wrong with it? The beef came out before the bread was ready. Whoever's running the oven isn't communicating with whoever's managing the grill. She paused. It's a simple fix. Don't tell them. I wasn't going to tell them. A beat. I was just noting it. He smiled. Actually smiled the full version, which was rare enough on Wyatt Mercer's face that Emma looked at it for a moment, as if confirming it was real. What? He said. Nothing. She looked at her plate. You don't smile like that very often. I don't have occasion very often. He looked at her. Today was a good day. Today was a very good day, she agreed. They were quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them, other conversations, other tables. The ordinary noise of a town that didn't know what had happened in the Pacific Continental office that afternoon, or what it meant for 800 railroad workers who were going to start eating better, or for a ranch that was going to clear its debt by spring, or for 2 people sitting at a table in Cheyenne who had started as a transaction and become something neither of them had a clean word for yet. Emma, Wyatt said. Wyatt? The contract. When it goes through, the operation is going to be substantially larger than what we've been running. He held her gaze. That means it's yours. Legally. Your operation, your revenue, your name on the contracts. He paused. I want to make that formal. She went very still. What do you mean formal? I mean, I want the attorney in town to draw it up properly. The food service operation is yours, not the ranch's, not mine. Yours. He said it plainly without ceremony. You built it. You should own it. Emma looked at him across the table for a long time. Something moved in her face, something she was controlling, but less thoroughly than usual, because they were not in the kitchen, and there was no work immediately at hand to redirect herself to. You don't have to do that, she said. Her voice was careful. I know I don't have to. I want to. He held her eyes. You came here on a contract that said you were a cook. You're not a cook. You never were. And I think you deserve to have that be something real and legal and entirely yours. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at her hands on the table. When she looked back up, the careful control was still there, but something else was present alongside it, something open and unguarded and genuine that she was not for once immediately putting away. All right, she said softly. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. It's the correct thing. You keep doing the correct thing, she said. It keeps surprising me. It shouldn't. No, she said. I'm starting to think it shouldn't. The evening settled around them warm and unhurried. The first unhurried evening either of them had spent since the morning Emma had stepped off the train at Dry Creek Station, with her one trunk and her worn cookbook and her sharp assessing eyes that had looked at a failing ranch and seen immediately and without sentimentality everything it could become. They rode back the next morning with the signed contract in Emma's satchel. 2 days later, the news reached Richard Sloane. Wyatt wasn't present when it happened, but the account reached him through 3 separate sources within the week, each one more detailed than the last. The way information travels in a territory where everyone knows everyone's business and significant events are currency. Sloan had gone to the Wyoming Eastern's lead attorney when he heard. The attorney had told him that a private contractor entering an exclusive arrangement with a competing railroad was entirely within territorial law, that there was no grounds for injunction, and that the fake sanitation ordinance he'd used to block the camps was now a documented liability if the matter ever reached a judge. Sloan had apparently been quiet for a long time after that. 3 weeks later, the Wyoming Eastern's Board of Directors received a detailed report on the food service situation, the competitive loss, the blocked contractor, and the false ordinance. The report had been written by the company's internal auditor, who had been quietly concerned about Sloan's methods for some time, and had found in this particular situation both the evidence and the occasion to put that concern on the record. Richard Sloan was removed from his position before the month was out. Emma heard about it on a Tuesday morning from the postal clerk in town, who heard it from the attorney, who heard it from someone at the territorial commissioner's office. She came home, set her basket on the kitchen table, and told Wyatt. He looked at her. "How do you feel about that?" She considered the question honestly. "I didn't want him removed," she said. "I wanted him out of my way. Those are different things." She paused. "But I'm not sorry." "You shouldn't be." "No." She picked up her notebook, opened it to the supply projections for the first Pacific Continental run scheduled for the following Monday. "I have 14 things to do before Friday. Will you look at the East Barn capacity I need to know if we can store an additional supply order there?" Wyatt looked at her, at the notebook, at the list, at the woman who had just heard that the man who tried to crush her operation had been removed from power and had processed it in approximately 45 seconds before returning to the work. "East Barn," he said. "I'll check this afternoon." "Thank you." He went to the door. Stopped. "Emma." She looked up. "I'm glad you answered that letter," he said. "The agency letter. I'm glad you came." She held his gaze across the kitchen, across the 6 weeks and the 6 camps, and the contract in Cheyenne, and the $11 on the table. And all of it, the whole accumulated weight of what this ranch had become since the morning she'd walked through that kitchen door and found a tarp in good condition, and a supply list full of waste, and a man who needed a cook and didn't know yet what he actually needed. "So am I," she said. Simple as that. True as anything she'd ever said. Wyatt nodded once, walked out into the afternoon to check the East Barn because there was work to do, and the work was good, and the ranch was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. And behind him in the kitchen, Emma Mercer opened her notebook to a fresh page and started building the next thing. The first Pacific Continental run went out on a Monday morning before dawn. 4 wagons. 800 portions. Rose driving the second wagon alone for the first time on a contract run. Martha on the third, Billy on the fourth. Emma riding alongside on horseback because she needed to see every camp personally on the first day of an exclusive contract, needed to know the foreman by face and name, needed to walk through the handoff herself. So there was no ambiguity about standards going forward. Wyatt watched them leave from the porch. 4 wagons in a line moving east in the gray pre-sunrise, and he stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand, thinking about the morning 8 weeks ago when he'd watched one wagon head out with a canvas tarp rigged over the bed and $11 worth of hope on board. Cal came and stood beside him without being asked. They watched the wagons until the dust settled. "She's going to need more staff by October," Cal said. "I know. 2 of the Henderson boys are looking for work. Reliable. I've known their father 15 years. Wyatt looked at him. "You're recruiting for her now." Cal shrugged the shrug of a man who has made peace with a reality and sees no reason to be dramatic about it. "Someone has to think ahead." Wyatt almost said something, decided against it, drank his cold coffee. "Talk to Emma when she gets back." Cal nodded and went back to his work, and Wyatt stood on the porch a minute longer alone, thinking about what it meant that his most stubborn ranch hand was now quietly solving staffing problems for his wife's food operation before she'd asked him to. It meant the ranch had changed. Not in the way a ranch changes when a season turns or a herd grows. In the deeper way. The way a place changes when it becomes something people choose to belong to, rather than somewhere they happen to be.
Chapter Team.
Emma came back at 4 in the afternoon with empty wagons and a look on her face that was not triumph, but something more durable. The quiet satisfaction of a person who has executed a plan correctly and knows exactly what needs adjusting before the next run. She debriefed with Martha at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, straight to business. Camp foreman names delivery timing issues at Camp 4, a supply weight miscalculation on the cornbread that needed correcting for Thursday. Rose sat across from them, taking notes in a hand that was starting to look. Wyatt noticed remarkably like her mother's compact, precise, efficient. When Martha and Rose left, Emma sat alone at the table for a moment. Just sat. The notebook was closed for once, her hands flat on the table, her eyes somewhere in the middle distance. Wyatt poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without comment. She looked at it, then at him. "Thank you." First run good. First run was exactly what it needed to be. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Camp 6 foreman shook my hand at the end and said his crew hadn't eaten that well since the last time they'd been home. She paused. He said it like it surprised him. Like he'd expected something adequate and gotten something that meant something. Wyatt sat down across from her. "That's going to get around. That's the point." She looked at her coffee. "Men talk. Workers tell other workers. By next month, the camps we're not serving yet will have heard about the ones we are." She paused. "This is how you build something that can't be undone. Not through contracts and paperwork, though those matter. Through the fact that people rely on you, and they know it, and you've never given them a reason to doubt it." She said it quietly, almost to herself, and Wyatt listened and understood that she was talking about more than the food operation. She was talking about a principle she had been living by for years before she arrived at this ranch. A principle that had carried her from a farm in Ohio to a hotel kitchen in Cincinnati, to a boarding house in Columbus, to a cattle ranch in Wyoming. Always building, always finding the thing that needed building and building it better than anyone expected. "Emma," he said. She looked up. "The attorney is coming Friday to do the paperwork on the operation." He held her eyes. "I want you to look at the ranch deed as well." She went very still. "Why?" "Because the ranch is as much yours as the food operation. You saved it. You should have legal standing in it." He kept his voice level and direct the way she kept hers. "I've thought about this since Cheyenne. It's the correct thing." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was quiet the late afternoon, settling around them, the sounds of the ranch outside, a horse in the yard. Cal's voice somewhere near the barn, the ordinary working sounds of a place that was alive and intended to stay that way. "That's not a small thing," she said carefully. "What you're offering." "No," Wyatt said. "It's not. You barely knew me 2 months ago." "I know," he said. "I know you now." Something shifted in her expression, a quiet internal movement, like a door that has been braced against opening finally easing on its hinges. She looked at her coffee, looked at the table, looked at this kitchen where she had spent 8 weeks reorganizing a failing operation into something that was now feeding 800 workers and growing. "All right," she said, the same words she'd used in Cheyenne, but softer this time, carrying more weight. "All right, Wyatt." He nodded. Neither of them said anything further. They didn't need to. Some agreements are made in language, and some are made in the quality of a silence between 2 people who understand each other, and this was the second kind. The twist nobody saw coming arrived on a Wednesday in the form of a letter from the Wyoming Eastern Railroad. Not from Sloan. Sloan was gone. The letter was from the new territorial director, a man named Gerald Webb, who had been brought in to clean up the operational mess Sloan had left behind. Webb's letter was different in every way from Sloan's. It was straightforward, apologetic in tone, without being theatrical about it, and it contained a proposal that was Wyatt read it twice to make sure he was understanding it correctly, an offer for Emma's operation to supply the Wyoming Eastern's northern grade camps as well. He brought it to Emma in the kitchen. She read it once, set it down, read it again. "He's offering better terms than Pacific Continental," she said. "I noticed." "He knows I'm already contracted with Pacific Continental." "He knows. He's not asking you to break the contract. He's asking if you have capacity for both." Wyatt watched her face. "Do you?" Emma picked up her notebook, opened it to the expansion projections she'd been quietly building for the past 2 weeks, the ones she hadn't shown him yet because she was still testing the numbers. She turned the notebook to face him. He looked at the page, at the staffing column, at the supply chain map she'd drawn, which now covered both rail grades and connected them through a central supply hub she'd located with characteristic precision at the exact geographic midpoint between the two operations. "You already planned for this," he said. "I planned for the possibility," she said. "I didn't know it would come from Webb. I thought it might come from one of the independent camp operators on the northern grade." She looked at the letter again. "This is better. Why didn't you tell me you were planning for it?" She looked at him. "Because I didn't want you to think I was getting ahead of myself." It was one of the most honest things she had said to him in 8 weeks of honest conversation, and it landed with weight because of what it revealed. That underneath the certainty and the precision and the flat competence, there was a woman who had spent her entire working life in rooms where getting ahead of herself was the thing they waited to use against her. And old habits were old habits, even when the room had changed. "Emma," Wyatt said, "you have never once gotten ahead of yourself. You've been 3 steps ahead of everyone else, and that is an entirely different thing." She looked at him. Then she looked at the notebook. Then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She laughed a short, slightly unsteady laugh, the laugh of a person releasing something that has been held under pressure for longer than was probably healthy. "The Henderson boys," she said. "Cal mentioned them this morning. I know, I need 4 people, not 2, but it's a starting point." She was already writing. "I'll need to talk to Martha about restructuring the supply runs. And Rose needs a raise. She's doing the work of someone twice her experience, and I've been underpaying her since the 2nd week." She paused. "I've been meaning to correct that. Do it Friday when the attorney comes." "I will." She looked at the Webb letter one more time, then set it on top of the Pacific Continental contract in the corner of the table where her important documents lived. 2 railroad contracts, an exclusive on one grade, a new arrangement on the other. 8 weeks from a single wagon and $11. "Wyatt," she said without looking up from her notebook. "Emma. Thank you for bringing me the letter instead of answering it yourself." He looked at her. "It was your letter to answer." "I know." She looked up. "But not everyone would have seen it that way." He held her gaze. "I'm not everyone." "No," she said quietly. "You're not." October came in fast and cold, the way Wyoming Octobers always did, with a wind off the northern range that reminded you the territory didn't accommodate sentiment. The operation had grown to exactly what Emma's notebook had projected in August. 11 staff, including the 2 Henderson brothers, and 4 women from the county, 3 of whom had never held paying work outside their households, and had arrived nervous and left each day with the specific confidence of people who have discovered they are good at something. Rose Gaines was managing the northern route independently. Martha was running supply procurement with an efficiency that had within 6 weeks reduced the per-meal cost by 9% without touching quality. Billy Dawson had been promoted to operations foreman, a title that hadn't existed before Emma invented it, which meant he was the one who solved problems in the field when Emma couldn't be present. He was 20 years old and took the responsibility with the seriousness of a man twice his age, and the occasional undisguised pride of a young person who has been trusted with something real. The debt on the East Pasture was paid in full in September. Wyatt had stood in the bank watching the teller process the payment and had felt the specific sensation of a weight he had been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him finally lifting clear. He'd told Emma that evening. She'd said, "Good, now we can talk about the north fence repair without it being contingent on anything." He'd laughed. actually laughed the full version, and she'd smiled at him in a way she was doing more often now openly, without redirecting herself immediately back to the work. The evening that settled into ranch legend happened on the second Friday of October. It started ordinarily. Emma had been away for 2 days on a supply negotiation in the next county, the longest she'd been away from the ranch since Cheyenne and the Cowboys had managed their own meals in the interim. Through a combination of Cal's limited but sincere efforts and a cold storage, Emma had stocked with enough prepared food to cover 3 days. They had managed. They had eaten. They had been fine. But by the second evening, something had shifted in the bunkhouse in the way that things shift when a significant presence is absent, and its absence makes the presence legible, in a way it wasn't when it was simply there. Old Pete Harlow. Pete, who complained about everything as a matter of philosophy. Pete, who had been on the ranch longer than most, sat down to a supper of adequately prepared beans and adequately prepared salt pork, and ate 3 bites and put his fork down. "It's not the same," he said. The table was quiet. "It's food," Cal said. He said it fairly. He was defending the effort. "It's food," Pete agreed. "It's not the same." Nobody argued because everyone at the table knew Pete was right and was saying the true thing. It wasn't that the beans were bad. It was that they'd been eating Emma Mercer's cooking for 8 weeks and had forgotten, in the way you forget the quality of air until the air changes what it was like before. Billy Dawson at the far end of the table said what everyone was thinking. "She cooks like she means it." There's a difference between someone who makes food and someone who means it. The table absorbed this in silence. Cal looked at his plate. Then he said quietly to nobody in particular, "I told Wyatt on the first day she arrived that a ranch wife with soft hands wasn't going to help anything." He paused. "I was wrong about that." More silence. The significant kind. "She fixed my saddle girth problem." Cal continued, still talking to his plate. "Without being asked, without making a point of it, just fixed it the way she fixes everything, because she noticed." Old Pete picked his fork back up. "She noticed the flour storage was wrong on the first day she got here," he said. "I watched her. She didn't say anything to anyone, just started fixing it, like it was obvious and not worth commenting on." He ate a bite of beans. "It was obvious. None of us saw it." "None of us were looking," Billy said, and that was the truth that sat at the center of all of it. The truth that the table held together in the lamplight on the second evening of Emma's absence. They hadn't been looking. Not because they were bad men, but because nobody had taught them to look in that direction. Emma had arrived and looked at everything: the kitchen, the supply chain, the waste, the opportunity, the horses, the saddle. Girth, the radius of a railroad camp, the space between 2 competing rail lines, and had seen in all of it what could be built. Wyatt sat at the head of the table and listened to his men and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "When she gets back tomorrow, don't make it strange. She doesn't want ceremony. She wants to get back to work." "We know that," Pete said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." Cal looked at him across the table with the look of a man who sees more than he says. "You going to be all right, boss?" Wyatt looked at him. "What kind of question is that?" The kind that needs answering. The table was very quiet. 12 men eating beans and salt pork in the flickering lamplight, all of them looking at the end of the table where Wyatt Mercer sat, with the expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the most capable person in the room, and has recently unexpectedly joyfully found out he was wrong. "I'm better than all right," Wyatt said. Cal held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, picked up his fork. The table resumed the conversation, turning to ordinary things, the fence line and the winter feed situation, and whether the north barn needed its roof looked at before the first snow. Emma came back the following afternoon. She rode in on a horse that had covered 20 miles and dismounted with the efficiency of a woman who has places to be, handed the reins to Billy before he could offer, walked directly to the kitchen, set her satchel on the table, and opened her notebook to the supply negotiation results. And then she stopped. The kitchen was clean. Not adequately clean, properly. Clean the way Emma cleaned it, everything in its exact place. The stove damper adjusted correctly, the dry goods in order. The cold storage stocked and organized with a handwritten label on each shelf in handwriting she recognized after a moment as Cal Briggs's blunt, no-nonsense script. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the notebook, looking at her kitchen. Billy appeared in the doorway. Cal organized the cold storage. Said he watched you do it enough times that he knew how it was supposed to go. A pause. Pete swept. He wanted me to make sure you knew it was Pete specifically. Emma looked at the cold storage labels, at the swept floor, at the stove adjusted the way she would have adjusted it. She cleared her throat. The supply negotiation went well. We're saving 11 cents per pound on the northern route provision starting next month. That's great, Mrs. Mercer.